Progressives need to take the Ten Commandments back from the right-wing nuts, because these are not little rules. These are policy statements about how to organize public power in neighborly ways. The first three commandments, I assume you know them. The first three commandments are: remember that God is ultimate, not you, not the empire. The last six commandments is an affirmation that your neighbor must be treated with respect. And the whole thing ends with "thou shalt not covet." You cannot have a viable society when the power people are organizing the market and the legislature around their greed. You cannot. And we see it. And there is a waiting. So imagine that the church in the Persian period, in Nazi Germany, in the national security state among us, that the church meets regularly to mobilize its memory and its experience and its imagination to affirm that the world is not the way the national security state says it is. I always go to the airport early to catch a plane. It's the most quiet place I can find. So I always spent two and a half hours at the Cincinnati airport today. I didn't have anything else to do. Every 15 minutes. The anxiety level today is orange alert. I knew they were going to say it. I anticipated it. I don't know why they tell me. I don't know what they want me to do. Well, I know what they want me to do. They want me to be afraid. They want me to be very afraid. They want me to be suspicious of all my neighbors. They want me to be preoccupied with myself. Because the empire has figured out is that if you can keep people anxious and preoccupied with themselves and worried about their safety, take off your belt and take out your billfold, you will never have any energy for the neighbor. So in order to be a Jew in the Persian period, the Jews had to get together around Ezra to say that this story we got is more true than anything Persia says to us. And this little confessing church at Barmen in Germany made these 6 statements in 1934 that Jesus Christ is more reliable than the German National Socialism. I think that's a characterization of the task of the church in the national security state in the United States. As we are able, each of us, to move outside the anxiety and the fear and the self-preoccupation and the greed, to say what we're really about is constructing a neighborhood of generosity and hospitality because we are unafraid of our neighbors. Now, I understand that it's difficult, and I understand that it's complex, and I understand that I'm as cautious about this as any of you are. I understand all that. But I say these things to you because this is a wonderful, wonderful moment for the church. This is a moment when the dominant narrative of our society has failed. And we come along and say, we got another way to put this. because this elusive, irascible God has not been reduced to a dead idol by the empire. What Von Rad shows is that they found many ways to tell this story. In Psalm 78, I'm going to mention a bunch of long psalms that we never read, but you have my permission to do it. In Psalm 78, the psalm eventuates by saying, and that leads to David, who is the Messiah. They make it very political. Psalm 105 goes through 44 verses of memory, and verse 45 says, in order that we may keep the covenant and obey the Torah. Psalm 106 goes through 46 verses of memory and ends in verse 47 by saying, save us. Psalm 136 may be the best one. When my son was in the 5th grade in Webster Groves, I had to go to a god-awful PTA meeting. And I could tell it was a big night because the teacher was walking around in a white suit with a baton. And the 5th graders did a choral reading of American history that they had learned. And one kid said, George Washington is the father of our country, and then all the 5th graders said, and America goes on forever. And Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration, and then America goes on forever, and I think they finally got to Ronald Reagan. Psalm 136 says, he brought us out of slavery, and God's faithfulness endures forever. He led us into the waters, and God's faithfulness endures forever. He gave us man in the word, and God's faithfulness endures. God's faithfulness. It's not about our going on forever. It is about covenantal fidelity that is at the heart of reality. So what I want to say to you is that I think the church has found ways of avoiding these issues by arguing about trivia. By arguing about what, I see you don't have any carpets, about what color should the carpet be? Or who should be ordained, for God's sake? I can't measure the Presbyterian adrenaline that's been used on that. Well, we ought to be talking about, we liberals and conservatives in the church, we ought to be talking about how do we find a zone of dignity and fidelity and freedom to live out our baptism in the midst of the national security state. And liberals have no high ground about that, and conservatives have no high ground about that. We are all intimidated, and we are all on orange alert. So the big question is, do we have a story to tell that is better than the story of the empire? And if we do, we need to get it straight. So imagine Jews in Persia standing up tall and living their faith. Imagine Christians in Germany saying we do not subscribe to National Socialism. Imagine Christians in the United States finding ways to call the bluff on the ideology of the national security state. Imagine Christians in South Africa with the Belhar Confession saying it's not right to have a black church and a white church, because in Christ there is neither east nor west nor neither, but all are one in one great fellowship. So we've a story to tell to the nations that will turn their hearts to the... We have a story to tell. I love to tell the story. And if you go down to the third verse, it says, the old, old story will become the new, new song. That's what they were singing in South Africa. We are marching in the light of God, we are marching. So we are at a crisis point in the church in the United States. And we get to ask whether we're going to spend our energy thinking about survival of the institution, or whether we're going to have this incredible energy and freedom, because when our story is straight, it's perfectly clear that it's more adequate than the big story that's floating around outside of us. There are many ways to tell that story. They devised two creeds to tell that story. Calvinists mainly say the Apostles' Creed, and Episcopalians say the Nicene Creed. And all of us can say at Holy Communion, Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again in glory. Many ways to tell the story about the irascible, elusive God who is still making promises and freeing slaves and giving commandments. Because the sum of having our story straight is we are baptized and we belong and we are sealed forever as Christ's own. It's a very dangerous narrative.